Hello again. Right, now we're going to have a little look at drawing some fabric folds, which is a really interesting exercise, partly because you look at the fabric and you see a nice soft kind of flump of the fabric coming down, and you want to be able to try and recreate that. But when you start looking with a lot of detail, you start to notice that there are some really sharp edges of light and shade, aren't there? And remember from previous tutorials, we were looking very much at the importance of the lines where the light meets the dark. These lines that you would draw, the quality of those lines are so important because they describe the texture to us. So you see along this fold here, where the line of light and dark, this edge here is very crisp and clean and clear, isn't it? So that immediately signifies to our brain that the fabric is smooth, because if there was any texture here, there would be a variation in the shadow. There would be some kind of alternative way of describing this light and shadow jigsaw. So despite the softness of the fabric, there are actually very crisp, clean edges of light and shade, and that's very important for us to be able to replicate in our drawing. Now we're going to use pencil for this, and I'm going to show you how I would approach some of the more intricate folds like this area here and how to get started. Now with my drawing, I have worked out the drawing in exactly the same way that I have done with previous drawings, and this is up to you as to what makes it easiest for you to see and translate your pencil drawing onto a new piece of A4. I used a grid, and I did the same grid on my A4 paper, and I've rubbed out the grid so I can see the pattern of lines. And I've got a fresh photograph here, so there aren't any lines, any grid over the photograph to get in the way of the exercise. Now, sometimes it's a little bit confusing when you start to do the drawing and you end up with this road map here of lines. And these lines, if you find that it's a little bit confusing to work out which areas are light and which areas are dark, feel free to do some soft shading as you're going, so you can remember more clearly which shapes and which shadows are where. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this underneath there and do a little exercise for you. So let's just go in a little bit closer on that and we'll look at some of this. Now I'm keeping it really simple. I've just got my 2B pencil and a standard school eraser, a hard plastic eraser. I do have my putty rubber if I want to create any soft texture. And but sometimes you don't need all of these different bits of equipment. So I want to keep it really simple, just to show that even just one pencil and all of the techniques we've discussed before about how to translate the image, you can still make really beautiful drawings. Now remember, as we've discussed every time so far with all these drawing exercises, all of the lines that you put on your new paper, they are not just lines in the real world, are they? They're always shadows, no matter how fine the shadow. And the more you can say to yourself, what can I see? Why am I able to put these lines on this piece of paper? What is it that I'm seeing? And the more you can understand that each line you draw on your piece of paper is the edge of a shadow. It's a change of light. You can see these because the light changes and it creates a difference in tone. And of course, even though this image is in colour, you want to straight away be thinking about your 3 tones, those 3 most important tones: lightest, darkest, and then everything that's in between. Now I want to make sure that on my white paper I'm leaving some areas as white paper so the picture really pops out. So I want to make sure there's a really strong contrast between the brightest areas, the darkest areas, and then some of the shading in between. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, that all of these edges of the folds where the light meets the dark, they're very crisp, aren't they? So I want to make sure I'm replicating that in my drawing. So I'm going to start here, just at this fine cusp. And remember that each of these lines is a shadow. So you want to always say to yourself, which way does the line go? So which way does the line that I've drawn turn into the shadow? So here along this line, you can see how there's a very fine shadow there, but the space underneath my line is much lighter, isn't it, than the space above? So this line that I've drawn there becomes the shadow in this slightly darker fold of fabric. Now I'm just going to do a few vertical lines there, which starts to get the sense of the fabric folding down, but you can equally do sideways, very soft shading. I'm just pressing very lightly. You might find that you need to go over your drawing at the end and just change the balance of light and shade. It can be quite hard to anticipate how some of the drawing's going to turn out later. But I'm starting with this point here because it feels like quite a centralized point, and there's some very fine detail there. Now, one really important part to look at is this. There's such a small amount of information there, which tells us a great deal. There's a little light U shape, which is really important around that crease. So I want to make sure that I am allowing for that. So having the dark line that comes underneath and then up at this corner, but then there is actually a little gap. The dark line comes down here, the very fine shadow, and then it actually creates a little U shape there. And this is another great example of working out which way the line goes. So the line that I've seen underneath here, of course it becomes the shadow there. So I'm blending this line up. Remember, there are no outlines anywhere, just shadows and the jigsaw of light and shade. So I'm going to bring that little bit of shading up. Now, when you're creating a white space, like in the magnolia exercise, you might start with a larger area of light and you can make it smaller, and you want to make sure that you're creating nice crisp edges, which doesn't mean outlines because you're always blending the line that you've done. So this edge here of shadow, my pencil work needs to blend into the darker area of fabric there. And that just helps me to see what's happening at that quite pivotal point. Now here there's another sharp shape of shadow which I want to put in. So I'm just experimenting with where the darkest shapes are. And you see around here, that's another very dark shape. And I want to establish some of these darkest areas, which will help me to work out then what all of my midtones are. So here, again, another great place to see that the line that I've got along here, the line becomes this dark shadow, becomes the dark shadow of the fabric all the way up here. So although it feels like I'm strengthening this line to make it look like an outline, I'm then blending that line into the shadow. So we lose the line itself and it just becomes that lovely big block of shadow. Now, you know that I like just using a single pencil, partly just for ease. You don't have to keep swapping pencils over, but also being able to vary the pressure that you use in your art is actually quite important to be able to see, just by using one simple material, how much variation you can get. So you see there's a definite sharp edge of shadow within that shadow. So every single time I'm creating a new shadow, I'm always saying to myself, what can I see? So if I can see that there's a line of shadow in there, I want to make sure that I'm putting it in. All the time asking yourself, what can I see? And you'll find that more and more the conversation speeds up. You're able to see what's there much more quickly as you go. And always that little conversation with yourself, that what you're drawing shapes of shadows, and that always that jigsaw of light and shade. So here I'm looking at the curve of shadow, and I'm not just looking at the curve itself. I'm looking at this space here in relation to this space there. So I want to make sure that when I do this shape of shadow, it's much darker and crisper than this, which is quite a soft area of shadow. So I'm actually going to put this one in first, which gives me a context, and again a good strong sharp line there. And in fact there's a really sharp line of shadow going all the way up here, so maybe I would just reinforce that and all the way down, and that's a very, very clear area of light and dark. And I'm going to fill in this block. And remember, inside these shadows, it doesn't really matter how you create the marks with your pencil, as long as the edges, you see, as soon as I do that, look, I'm creating a zigzag shape, and instantly the brain understands, well, there must be cuts into the fabric or additional folds for us to be able to see the shadow that's behind. So it completely changes the look of the fabric. That's why it's very important to maintain those crisp edges. And you might just need to sharpen your pencil to get those, but you don't want to have a line which stands out starkly. If you create a crisp edge and it really stands out, it means that you need to blend it into the shadow. There are no outlines anywhere. So now, having this block of darker shadow in there, I can start to create, you see, I'm just doing light motions with the pencil, just shading in this area here. I don't want this to be too dark. Oh, a little bit of rubber on the page. I don't want this to be too dark, and I can always go back in later to change the balance. And up here there's another very clear line of shadow. Again, can be quite scribbly when you're filling it in, just making sure, if you can, that your motions with the pencil are quite even, which allows you to blend no matter how scribbly it feels. And I haven't done any smudging yet. This is all just with the pencil. And remember, I can go back and lighten some areas. I can use the putty rubber to create some additional light if I need to. And now on this side, so you'll notice that I'm focusing on the dark areas at the moment, just to keep that balance of the darkest, the lightest tones, and then everything in between. And even here, there's still quite a sharp shape of shadow. What's going to be interesting is this bit where it's a little bit more diffused. So I'm just going to bring my shadow. Now I'm going to make some lovely long marks. Now remember where you hold your pencil. You see, I'm holding it a little bit closer than I was with the magnolia, where I had it much further back there. But just to have a little bit more pressure, I've got my fingers slightly closer to the nib of the pencil, but I'm not holding it like this. So just have a look at your pencil and your fingers and check that you're not doing that, which is very much like a biro writing style. And it will mean that you have less movement with the pencil. So here, if you want to do a little bit of smudging, which can sometimes help with blending some of those pencil marks. Of course you can do that. Now here, you see that I've continued my dark line along there because this area is much lighter than this area, and we've got the shadow just behind the fold there. Now obviously there isn't a single line, that starts to look quite cut out, but you can see when you look very closely that the line starts to diffuse up into this fold. So I'm just going to blend that line to soften it into the shadow. And along here, where it starts to get a little bit more subtle, just going to press less hard. Now, if you want to, you can create the look of the fold by doing circular or curved motions, and that can also, not only can it help you to then see what the shape is, but it can create some sense of the fabric texture. But really, if you start looking at the simple blocks of light and shade, I don't think you need to worry too much about how detailed you get with some of the stitching. And I mean, you can start off by doing it quite simply. So I'm using the putty rubber here just to remove a few of those lines that I did, which I don't think are necessary at this stage. But if you've done a bit of drawing before and you really want to get fine detail, of course, feel free. Now, this is an interesting bit here. Because the photograph has a wall in the background, the fabric itself at these areas, of course, there isn't a line there, is there? The line that we're seeing is the change of light between the edge of the fabric and the background. Now, the fabric in both cases, on both sides, is lighter than the background. So that means, of course, that my line here becomes the background. And I want to put this shadow in so the fabric absolutely pops out, and it's much easier to draw what's there. Rather than having two lines in a V shape at the top, I want the picture to reflect and replicate what we're actually looking at in a photograph. I'm just going to give that a bit of soft smudging, and I'm just going to also smudge over into this area of fabric just to show you that if you find that sometimes the hand goes over the drawing when you're working on it, and it can feel quite frustrating. And just if that happens, it's never a problem. You can, if you've got a putty rubber, you can use that to clean up any smudges really cleanly, crisply, nice edges. Of course, you can just use the normal eraser, but when you're rubbing away the little bits of eraser that are left on there, just make sure you don't then re-smudge everything. Okay, so what this is now replicating, you can see that there's quite an extra dark shape there, which shows that I haven't quite blended that neatly enough into the background. I'm just going to do some sideways lines just to disguise that dark halo that's being created around the edges of the fabric. But the effect that that will have is that now we're seeing the brightness of the fabric standing out against the darkness of the background. And no matter what you're drawing, I would always suggest creating the context of the image. So if you've got areas in your drawing, in your photograph and in your drawing which have some background, even if you just do a little bit of light shading, like I showed with the magnolia and with the pear as well, with just putting a little bit of context, so you're seeing all of the light and shade as replicated through the photograph. So this area here, this is quite soft, this shadow over here, but there's a definite shape. Remember, every time you're saying to yourself, what can you see? So you might just lightly create the outside of the shadow shape. Here, again, if you want to, you can do some lines which come across. This is called cross-hatching, when you put lines going in different directions, and it can really help to explain and describe the nature of a fold and a curve. But equally, if you just get the shape of shadow right, you can make it quite a bold shape and it will still look exactly right no matter what direction your pencil marks are going in. And always look out for those little crisp changes of direction. See how clear that shape of light is there. So I want to make sure that I'm replicating that, and there's quite a dark curved sort of tear shape coming around there. So I want to put that in every time. Think about your three tones, the simplicity of those three tones, and say to yourself, what can I see? Okay, so hopefully this is giving you some good ideas about how to proceed with drawing fabric. The key, always looking carefully and saying, what can I see? So even here, let's say I just smudge all of that in. Sometimes it can be easier to have a dark shape that you then draw into with the rubber. So these very light areas there, I could either use my putty rubber, if I've got one, and I'm going to now draw in the light. So that can be another way around. You see how the shape is emerging there? Now, of course, you'll probably find that you rub out a larger area than you need to, unless you've got one of those tiny, tiny, tiny little electric erasers on the end of a pen, or something which can rub out very, very small areas. You might end up rubbing out more than you want to, and then you just close the space of light. And that helps me to now see that this needs to be a little bit darker, and just helps me to recreate that light and dark jigsaw in a slightly different way. The key is working out how you see things. Okay, now I'm sure that while you're watching this, you're absolutely itching now to have a go yourself. Maybe you've even started. That would be amazing if you've just been inspired and just straight away got on with it. So what I'd love for you to do is to print out this picture from the website, or you can use your own photograph of fabric. You can just set up a sheet or a blanket draped over a set of shelves or over the end of a table and take a photograph, print it out. It would be more personal for you. And of course, if it's got pattern on it, it makes it even more interesting. So as you can see, I'm just enhancing some of these clean areas of shadow and getting some of those lovely deep shapes in. And there'll always be a little bit of back and forth with the light and the shade. You know the story now, the conversation between light and shade. And I can see already, see how that's starting to emerge as a definite fold of fabric, even with these very crisp lines, which you don't necessarily think of. And up here, see, even just using some big, broad strokes and a little bit of smudging just to get a tiny bit of grey on there. And then I can enhance this division. See how crisp it is right up at the top. So I'm just using the edge of the pencil to get some real clarity. And remember, always when you have a crisp, clean, a dark line, you need to blend it into your shadow. All right, well, I quite like the way this is emerging, and I would love for you to now have a go. Hopefully this has given lots of tips on how to approach it, and you need very minimal equipment and always thinking about the balance of light and shade and the crisp clarity of those edges, And each time you get a little bit confused with the roadmap of lines and what is happening there, what is happening in your drawing, just say to yourself every single time, what can I see? And you will quite quickly stop worrying about asking yourself that question. And even if you have to ask yourself out loud, nobody's going to think you're nuts. Okay. Well, I'm going to carry on with this for a little bit and have some fun, and I'll show you how far I get later on. If I finish the drawing, I will put a picture on the website so you can see what it might look like, or even if I just finish a few more areas to give you some more ideas with technique and what a finished or some areas finished might look like. Okay, so you see they're now starting to really pop out with the soft flow of the fabric, but those lovely crisp edges of light and shade happening. Okay, over to you. Have some fun.